Wow, thank you, Brian. So I'm going to start with a gospel reading. And the text that I've selected for today is from Luke 8, verse 42 through 48. And this is one of the many healing stories that we hear in the gospel. As Jesus went, the crowds pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. And though she had spent all she had on physicians, no one could cure her. She came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment, and immediately her hemorrhage stopped. Then Jesus asked, "Who touched me?" When all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the crowds surround you and press in on you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me, for I noticed that power had gone out from me." When the woman saw that she could not remain hidden, she came trembling and falling down before him. She declared in the presence of all the people why she had touched him and how she had been immediately healed. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. So thanks, Brian. Wow, what a nice welcome. And I was so touched by what Araceli said about, I've been coming here mostly lurking on Zoom, but I've been coming here for about 3 years. And this is a welcoming community. And that welcoming community is like 90% of healing right there. It's so huge. And so, thank all of you for being who you are and creating the kind of place that you've created. For the past 25 years, as Brian said, I've participated in healing prayer ministries, first as someone seeking and needing healing prayer, then as a lay minister of healing, and then later as a hospital chaplain. And for the past year or so, Brian and I have been talking about the possibility of offering a healing prayer service, as he mentioned, here one night a month. So that brings us to today and why I wanted to share a message. But first I wanted to reflect on the Bible story. Jesus performed healing more than any other single act during his 3-year ministry on earth. And this particular healing story is instructive because the nature of her illness would have made this woman in the story ritually impure or untouchable. So much so that by touching Jesus' garment, just that little act, she risked being accused of causing that impurity to spread to him. Because in those days, women during their monthly cycle had to perform a ritual bath or a mikvah at the end of each cycle in order to move from being defined as unclean and therefore living out of community in isolation to being ritually purified and rejoining the community. But this woman, because of her illness, was constantly unclean, and so she was outcast for those 12 years. And it reminds me of how we think of a lot of illnesses even today. And it's also a meaningful story to me because unlike so many other stories in the Bible in which God moves first or Jesus takes the initiative, or healing stories where somebody's family comes up and says, this person is sick, please come heal them, she takes the risk herself. And she makes herself vulnerable by reaching out and touching the hem of his garment, which is an act of profound bravery, I think. And I want to say a little bit first, before I talk about what healing prayer in my experience is, about what it isn't. I think healing prayer appropriately gets a bad name. There are more than enough charlatans who will prey on our fears when we're up against illness or suffering in exchange for a buck, who will offer us what we think we need from God on order and on time. And this is not, in my experience, what healing prayer is. nor is it meant to prey on our superstitions. You know, in Jesus' time, illness was considered an outward sign of sin. So with respect to that woman, the question that people would have asked was what sin caused her illness? Or maybe who sinned? Or who put a curse on her? You know, but those would be the question. And I think those beliefs are not entirely gone. Over the years working at hospitals like Meriter at the Carbone Cancer Center, I've seen many people facing cancer or other life-threatening illnesses wondering, what could I have done to avoid this? Or why me? I've done so many good things, as if illness was based on merit. And I think that's a very human view, but it's also pretty superstitious and it's inaccurate. As a professor of mine once said, we are all temporarily able-bodied. You know, I mean, it's not going to last forever. And we can lose it at any time for different reasons. And I wanted to share a story briefly of a leukemia patient I worked with years ago. He was in his 40s. I'll call him John. And I became very close with him and his family over a period of months. And he really, really believed that if he were a good enough Christian, God would give him a miracle. And hundreds of members of his church prayed with him. He was a loving father of young children. He was a leader in his church community. By all measures, he was an upstanding guy. And he believed that God would give him a miracle cure. And one day I sat in the oncologist's office with John and his wife the day the doctor tried to tell them that the miracle he had asked for was not coming, and that his cancer had unfortunately come raging back after treatment. And the doctor wanted him to check into the hospital that day to begin palliative care. But John told the doctor, I'm not ready to quit fighting. I know God's going to give me my miracle, and instead took his family and went up north to their lake house where they could pray and enjoy some family time. And that night, John had a crisis that led him to try to go to the hospital, and he died in terrible pain in an ambulance, rushing him to the hospital nearest his lake house. And if you know northern Wisconsin, it wasn't very near. And he left behind a family that was traumatized by both how he died and that he was not given the miracle that everyone expected. And, you know, this is what a lot of times we think is healing prayer or the failure of healing prayer. And when I went to his funeral, I wondered how the pastor would handle this seeming failure on God's part. I mean, certainly if anyone deserved a miracle, John did. And indeed, at the service, John's pastor spoke of his many good qualities. But when it came time to address the expected miracle, the pastor only said, there must have been a blight on John's soul that we didn't know about. You know, and my heart broke that day. This is not a story of God's healing or what healing is about. First, because God's healing is not about merit. I mean, if any of you have had experience of God's love, we all know it's completely unearned. And in none of the healing stories does Jesus say, I've done an audit of your good and bad qualities. And your good qualities have on balance made you well, right? That doesn't happen. And second, in my experience, healing is not about giving God a to-do list. Only God knows the ways in which we truly need to be healed. And if we insist on receiving what we want and only what we want in healing prayer or in prayer to God, we miss the ways in which God is active and is healing us. So let me take you back to my experience of receiving healing prayer for the first few times. It started in my life when, after a pretty unhappy childhood and then some misspent teens and 20s, it seemed like my life was finally coming together. It was going well. I had married a nice man. We had both gone to graduate school together. Our careers were taking off. We were in our mid-30s. We were starting a family or trying to start a family, and we felt really blessed, like God is on our side. And then my husband was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And in the subsequent years, he endured 3 painful rounds of cancer treatment. We lost our hoped-for chance for children. Our financial security went with medical bills. Our careers were derailed, and ultimately, we lost his life. And, you know, I kind of got opened up to the idea of healing prayer at that point, and I had a friend who went to this big evangelical church, and she said, our pastor has such healing powers, you have to go. And I'm like, you know, at this point, you know, this was early in the cancer journey, but I was desperate. And I'm like, sure, I will go. And I went up, there was like a long line of people, and I went up, and it was one of those ones where they were being slayed in the spirit. And I got, and there were people to catch you. And I got up to the front, and he, you know, did the thing, and the hand on my head, and he, oh, you know, Jesus, what? And I wasn't slayed. You know, I didn't go down. I was like, should I pretend to fall? Just so, you know, these folks will have somebody to catch, or, you know, or like, did it not work because I didn't fall? You know, like it was just like all this stuff going through my head. And, you know, I felt like a real failure when I left that service. At the same time, my first husband's mother was sending money to a healing prayer radio station nationwide that would, you know, for $25 a week, you know, say his name, say Greg, and, you know, heal Greg on the radio. And that didn't work either, you know, surprisingly. And then somewhere in the midst of our cancer journey, I went to this Episcopal church that was my home church for a long time in Boston, and they had a big healing prayer ministry. And one of the things that was really amazing about it was they used this text to teach healing prayer. They taught the ministers of healing that they should emulate his garment's hem, you know, to be as translucent, as still, as present, and that their job was not to say how the person should be healed or how their prayers should be answered or to act instead of God, but just be that, you know, conduit between God and the person who was praying. And so I would go up, and after communion, we had a little side chapel, and I would go up and I would kneel at the rail, and the nice person would lean over, and I would say what my was on my heart. And they would lay hands on me and sometimes anoint me with oil. And what started to happen was I started to feel God's love. And it was in these moments, and I could feel the whole congregation behind me praying with me, because this was during our regular service. And at one point, you know, what I started to notice was the healing that was taking place in me was that I started to be less insistent on, please make my husband live forever, and more present to what was happening every day. And more present to what could I do as a loving partner to show up every day. I went from being isolated and embittered in this journey to feeling the power of community. I went from being this harridan on the cancer wards who terrified all the doctors. Everybody would duck and cover when I came because I was like, I've read the latest study and you're not doing it right, to somebody who tried to partner with the folks who were there. And, you know, years later, when I was the leader of that healing ministry, I was often given an invitation to give workshops on healing to those hoping to add healing prayer to their services. And at one point, I was asked, how can you do this ministry when it obviously didn't work in your life? And, you know, they had a point. On some level, on some measure, as a healing minister, I had failed. You know, after 5 years of cancer, my husband died. And he had died when he was young, and he was a marathoner, and he, you know, juiced and ate organic food and was a non-smoker and a non-drinker. And had all these reasons why he should have gotten better, and I prayed for him every day, and he still died. And some might see that as a failure of healing prayer. But, we're all mortal. We all die. If we're fortunate enough to grow old, our bodies break down and bit by bit, and we lose the abilities we once took for granted. This is what it is to be human. Jesus didn't say to that hemorrhaging woman, "You will live on this planet forever." He said, "Your faith will make you well." So what's the line between faith and superstition, and how does God heal us? I believe that the answer lies in the difference between cure and healing, and between being free of illness and being made well. And I want to say, not that miracles don't happen. In my years as a minister of healing, I've seen life inexplicably prolonged. I saw it in my first husband's illness. We had a miraculous year of active life when he was terminally ill. He was on hospice riding his bike around town. But if we focus too much on cure and longevity, we miss the point of Jesus' message. Your faith has made you well. And in my experience, being made well means me moving closer to God, both in life and in death. And just as I have witnessed people who experienced relief from pain or inexplicable periods of remission from illness, I have witnessed those who healed into death, who mended broken relationships, who found serenity and peace with the lives they had lived, and who embraced life and death, both on God's terms. And in my own experience of this healing, I found that the more I surrendered the illusion that I could control how my life would turn out, the more God rushed into my heart to meet me. And that experience for me was the peace that Jesus said he would give to us. Not the peace that the world gives, but the peace that passes all understanding and is not dependent on the condition of our lives. And that, for me, is healing prayer. So as you think about whether a service of healing, like I've described, might be of use to you, think, where are the places you need to be healed? Could you bring them to Jesus and reach out and touch his garment's hem? Someone who was in a church that I did healing prayer in said, "I was healed in places I did not know were broken." Are there places that you need healing that you don't know are broken? And are you willing for them to be healed as well? The hemorrhaging woman gives us a model of radical trust in God in her brave act of reaching out. So I ask if you are willing to touch his garment's hem. Amen.